Alright, so in this video I want to talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is pain and suffering, and the hurt others inflict upon us and the hurt that we inflict upon others. Now, of course, obviously this doesn't apply to me or anyone watching this video. It's obviously, of course, everyone else in the world and everyone else's problem, because obviously, it's not something you and I have necessarily experienced, obviously. So what I hope to do in more seriousness is share some of my experiences and insights that have allowed me to kind of really chill out and let go of a lot of anger, frustration, resentment, reactivity, and many other things that honestly I spent a lot of my life really living in. And I'm 38 at this point, and I think I spent the vast majority of my life on this planet either being extremely afraid in my younger years, and then eventually transitioning that into anger, resentment, disappointment, frustration, all of those things. So after all this time of experiencing it and reflecting on it, really the common denominator that I really started to see was that everyone seems to just be reacting to something that someone else did, and then that person is reacting to something else that someone else did. And the common denominator there is basically everyone is in pain and everyone is uncomfortable and not really at ease within themselves. And it's just basically a cyclical thing of almost like telephone, to where if you maybe even reflect in your own life in things that you've experienced or things that you've done to other people or just even things in the world, you really start to see like, okay, well, maybe this person did this to me, but then, well, why? Well, usually because someone did something to them. Maybe they had a really bad childhood, or their parents abused them, or their parents died when they were super young, or their parents abandoned them, or many different things. So then you can say, okay, well then why did their parents do that? Oh, well, their parents did that because they experienced this thing, or their parents did this to them. Oh, well, why did they do that? Oh, well, they just did that because this thing or this, and it just kind of becomes this kind of like a game of telephone that we all kind of play. And another thing that I really noticed is that it's always someone else's fault, which led me to understand a few different things. First is that at a certain point, it's kind of our individual choice to take responsibility for something. And I don't mean that in necessarily like a cliche kind of way, which gets so easily thrown around and kind of really just devalued and dehumanized, and oftentimes is an excuse for repression or an excuse to sort of emotionally manipulate someone else. Meaning, like, you do something bad to someone else, and then they get upset, and then you're like, oh, well, it's your reaction, it's your responsibility and how you choose to react to this event. Or people do that to themselves and think, oh, well, everything that happens to me in my life, it's my choice how I want to react. And obviously, there's kind of a little bit of truth to that, but there's also a huge degree of getting it wrong and actually using it as an excuse to, like I said, either actively harm someone else or passively harm yourself or keep yourself in a negative situation. Because there's this weird stereotype that we have that we associate with, say, compassion or understanding or even love, or these different things which are obviously like positive virtues and things that obviously the world could probably use more of, and individually and collectively. But what I notice is that a lot of people use that oftentimes in kind of the way that I just illustrated, not applying it to themselves or using it on themselves in a way that basically keeps them frustrated, keeps them angry and bitter and resentful and stuck in situations that aren't particularly harmonious, and the same thing for other people. So it oftentimes just kind of becomes another passive-aggressive kind of manipulative strategy. And I don't think that a lot of people necessarily have the inner strength and stability and comfort to actively and really embody that kind of quality. Because this leads me to my other sort of insider understanding that I wanted to share in this video, is that Basically, being in this degree of pain, which, we all have various degrees of experiencing depending on where we are in our life and human condition, whatever, but it has a pretty similar effect in that it makes us all very small-minded and very self-absorbed, which if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is kind of obvious. If you look at kind of just understanding the mechanics of fight or flight within the nervous system, kind of obvious. You look at the function of the vagal nerve, kind of obvious. You look at just how it keeps us stuck in like really primitive parts of our brain, like kind of obvious. So we all kind of get it, but sometimes it's difficult to translate that over into something that's actually practical and tangible and useful and applicable to us, like in the here and now. So basically, yeah, the pain just makes us all very self-absorbed and self-focused and really kind of small-minded, which is why then it's very easy to do harmful things to others and do harmful things of ourselves, because we don't actually see really what we're doing or really the consequences and really what's actually happening. We're usually caught up in some fantasy or some delusion or some panic state that allows these things to occur. And this kind of distortion can appear on kind of two extremes. One is really self-absorbed, but that can also show up as in being really completely oriented towards other people, like a people pleaser or like a really extreme empath, or someone that kind of just lets themselves be a doormat or a piece of furniture or kind of really get used by other people. It's also still coming from the same place, and it's also still very self-absorbed, very small-minded, because of the same reasons I just explained. They're not able to actually see really what's going on in the situation, how their actions are leading to X, Y, and Z, and how the other person's actions are leading to X, Y, and Z. They're really still in this state. And, I've personally been on both extremes, and I've known people within both extremes. I've dated people on both, so I can relate to it with a fair degree of kind of firsthand knowledge, but also just being a little more observant and analytical. It's something I can see in a lot of people. And sort of, one is obviously a little more overt and easy to spot, and the other one's a little more covert, because people hide behind virtue, or they hide behind being a people pleaser and serving others and giving to others, because that kind of gives them like a moral shield, or kind of a pre-programmed like way to be like, oh, well, how dare you question or point a finger at this, because look at all this stuff that I've done for you, and look at how good I am and how virtuous and moral or high and upstanding, or fill in the blanks for ways that can manifest. But it's still coming from the same place. It's still a very usually self-absorbed, self-serving, could even dare say manipulative thing, because it's like both people on both extremes are operating from a place of pain and discomfort. So they're having to kind of, it's almost like, it's just kind of, if you think about it as an example of your physical body, if you really lean over to one side, a whole bunch of other stuff is going to have to engage to stabilize that position, because it's obviously distorted and obviously unnatural and not really comfortable. So all this other stuff has to engage and lock on as what we call a compensation pattern. But then that is, over the long term, extremely draining, extremely tiring, extremely uncomfortable. But the issue happens is that for a while it feels weird, but then eventually with everything, the body normalizes to it. Your sense of identity wraps around it, and that becomes your new normal. And then you just operate from that place. And then usually everything that came before it, it's like that door closes and you kind of just completely forget about it. So your identity is this distorted place. All your memories also start to twist and distort around this place, your behavior, your feelings, your emotions. And then what you see in the world is usually just going to reflect back and validate that distorted posture that you're holding. And that's not anything magical or esoteric. That's just how the identity works. That's how really we all function. We all live in like massive confirmation bias, and our lives exist just to kind of confirm and reconfirm and reestablish our identity. And that's oftentimes where things get scary for people, is the loss of identity. So like, even if the identity is really distorted and really dysfunctional and really exhausting and causes all this chaos, it can actually be in many ways very functional and very orderly, because it's predictable, it's familiar, and we could of course call it a form of disorder and imbalance, but actually at a certain point it becomes a certain kind of balance and a certain kind of order, because everything shapes around it, because the body or whatever our system just has this thing to where it kind of wants to try to find some equilibrium or some stability. So that is kind of what happens. And again, that's not anything magical or esoteric or weird. It's just cause and effect, stimulus and response. That's what our organism does. Like, if it's 110 degrees in this room, I'll start sweating. If it's negative 20, I'll eventually die, but I'll probably start shivering and get really cold at a certain point. It's just how this thing works. So those are just some of the things I wanted to share, basically. First, starting to understand, or I guess at least suggesting the idea that maybe there's other causes at play in a situation to where maybe someone does something wrong or you do something wrong or whatever, which even that can be a revolutionary step for some people, because it's very easy to always, it's basically easy to feel like a victim, to feel like, oh, this is a personal thing, which what I realized actually after experiencing a lot of betrayal, a lot of deceit, and just a tremendous amount of disappointment early on in my life, was that how I took it was, oh, it must mean, I don't know, X, Y, and Z about me, and this person must have had this agenda, and they must have wanted to do this, and all this grandiose thinking, which again, self-absorbed, small-minded, painful, discomfort, all these things. What I really realized by looking at it is, the vast majority of the time, you really don't factor in much at all to what people are doing. This is kind of the nature of life when you really take a hard, honest look at yourself, strip away all the virtue signaling, all the posturing and peacocking and politeness and fake whatever nonsense that you do to yourself on a completely consistent, full-time basis. We all do. I mean, that's just part of, again, how our identity functions, and how, the social glue and the fabric, how this kind of things go together, which again is good, but has its drawbacks. If you actually really get down to those things and really figure out what your actual real desires are, what your real aims, intentions, and agendas and motivations are, that is, I think, one of the more useful things that a person can do. But oftentimes what you find out is that the vast majority of the time it has very little to do with other people. It has mostly everything to do with you furthering agenda, bias, or your identity, or getting something or not getting something, or being afraid of getting something or being afraid of not getting something. It really comes down to oftentimes very simplistic things, which for some reason people think that they are very complex and that humans are very complex. What we're actually really not. I think if you really, strip away the noise and the emotional ups and downs and all the hormonal secretions and all the drugs and stimulation and hyperstimulation and depression, and find some kind of neutrality, it becomes very obvious just how simple many of us are. And again, this is not anything new or revolutionary. It's what basically every spiritual tradition, religion has been saying forever, and what most very intelligent people arrive at eventually at some point in their exploration. So getting back to my point is that even just sort of admitting that, oh, maybe this isn't really about me, and what people were doing can have larger causes that are having really nothing to do with me, and I just happen to maybe be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Even that can start to really unwind things, because that is just a little closer to what's true, which is more so ultimately what is my guiding principle or force or desire or motivation, is what's actually closer to true. Whether or not we can fully understand, ultimate truth ever, if that's even really a thing, is a different philosophical conversation, but at least something closer to truth that's a little more functional, a little more harmonious, and a little more moving towards feeling comfortable and at ease within ourselves and with life. So to me, that's kind of the thing. It just seems like, oh, that's actually just a little more true. There's all these other causes that are playing out. Then there was this intersection. Then maybe there was an interpretation on my part, but then that interpretation is based on this whole chain of causation and other experiences and memories. And then it starts to zoom out. So then you're dealing with this like big spider web and maze of things that happen to intersect. And then eventually it's like, well, what is, like, I'm trying to find, the enemy, I'm trying to find the victim and the villain, I'm trying to find the person to be mad at or to put the blame on or whatever. And eventually you're just like, oh, well, that's a little more difficult actually. So then you can maybe realize just how, at a certain point, maybe what I'm saying is closer to true, where, oh, it is just reacting from this place of pain and discomfort and really just trying to further some kind of identity or further some kind of agenda, which in this case is maybe negative because it's like leading to depression and anxiety and pain and these other things. So hopefully that makes sense and is somewhat coherent and useful. It's a few things that I've used within my own life to kind of have a different understanding, and how for myself that I know that it's at least closer to correct is that it has led to more comfort, more ease, more health improvements, more body improvements, tangible things in that way, but also just a deeper understanding of dealing with people and better communication, but also being able to more accurately predict the behavior and actions of people. So it's like, oh, okay, it must be approximating something more useful, more functional, because it's producing these actual tangible things versus, having the chemical rush of feeling right or feeling morally superior or feeling more virtuous or feeling all the things that come with just reaffirming identity and having confirmation bias and, the emotional ups and downs and drama that is really the addictive cycle that some of these things really put us on. To go back to my previous example, and I think this will be probably the last point that I make in this video, is that, using the example of really distorted posture, is that if that happens early on in life or something, for many people it does, and then for many people it doesn't, but then they make up and invent and try to dig through and find things that maybe possibly somewhat could have possibly, who knows, maybe under certain circumstances perhaps made them uncomfortable, which they can call that a trauma, which to me is odd. But again, different conversation, is that at a certain point that thing happens and that can sort of set, a different trajectory. So then usually all that's going to want to do is just attract more confirmation. And then that's going to have all of this feeling and this emotional sense of being correct and being right, even if it's negative. Whereas sometimes feeling closer to true and real and harmonious and balanced and comfortable, it doesn't have the chemical reaction and the chemical rush. It actually is usually the opposite. So it's kind of like, for many years, why I said if you hear something and you automatically are like, oh, sounds so true, this is so amazing. It's like there's a chance it's pretty likely that you're probably not actually hearing or understanding what's really being said, and it's just maybe confirming something else. Because at least what I've noticed is that usually things that are true are not that comfortable in the beginning, and then eventually leads to comfort, and then it just kind of chills out. And that it's not that crazy to think, because if you think about exercise or anything that actually makes you grow in a positive way, usually there's a portion of it that doesn't feel very good. Like if you're overweight and you start running, that's gonna suck. That's gonna not feel very good at all, and you're gonna be like, why am I doing this? This feels horrible. I actually feel way better just sitting on the couch and being lazy and eating garbage. That feels way better. I get way more out of that. So it's just one of those things to where, you can't actually trust your feelings all the time, which is, again, we start to get into murky waters, because on one hand there's like the extreme push now where people have this idea that their identity is their feelings, and their feelings are their identity, so they just go full into their feelings and think every feeling they have is valid and useful and should be indulged in and explored and whatever, which I don't think is actually true. I think people who live that way we would call children, because that's like means they haven't really developed past a certain age, which is why they need, supervision and guidance, because they're just running around by their feelings because they don't understand what's actually going on. So it's just odd to me that as like a psychological movement, or even like a spiritual movement nowadays, that's like a thing, which is like just makes zero sense to me. But I can understand how someone would go to that extreme if they perceive themselves coming from the other extreme, which was like complete emotional denial and suppression and repression and all those things. So if they perceive themselves all the way over here, then of course where they're going to go is all the way over here, which, okay, maybe that's a growth process, but it's also just another extreme, which means they're probably just going to go back, and they're going to just keep yo-yoing around, and it's just, again, another distorted pattern. But from here to here, this usually feels, going over here actually usually feels really good. So people think, oh, this is it. But it's like, no, you're just high. You just have novelty and the endorphins associated with it, which is another thing, even just relating to like psychedelics, which is another thing that is heavily related to all the things that I've just said, and it's going to be an even bigger growing trend. People think they have all these like crazy insights, which sometimes they do, which if they do, I'd say like, let's check in with their life 5 years down the line and see if it's really, changed and they're a different person. They've really done something. Usually that's not the case. Usually again, it comes back to the like the merry-go-round, like the yo-yo, the cyclical thing of it all, where that just becomes their new identity. But my point is that it's again another example of people feeling a lot, endorphins and neurotransmitters of all shapes and sizes, and having a cool experience, and then thinking, oh, this is it. But what I'm saying is like, that's what your identity wants. So that's honestly, it's just like if you're a drug addict and you're just giving yourself more drugs, but you're just maybe trying a different one or trying a stronger version of it, which is honestly, that's really where people are at now, is how can we just continually get stronger and stronger drugs and get more and more stimulated and more amped up and more complicated. Like personally, if I go through Instagram or anything social media related to a lot of these topics, I just want to throw up in my mouth on one hand, but I also feel really kind of bad for people, because it's like, oh, this is what's presented as the solution a lot of times, but the vast majority of the time it's just a really unhealthy person in pain discovered something, they're really high on it, and you're catching them, maybe at the upward trajectory of that wave, and it's all great, it's like all upside. It's like the early days of crypto. It's like, oh, you just invest, it's all upside, like everything just keeps doubling every day. But then you kind of have to zoom out, and zooming out is a little more my perspective and a little more how I've gotten over the years, and especially that's even how I was in my early 20s when I got into this. And eventually you zoom out long enough and you start to see people when they hit the other side of it. But again, by then there's new trends, there's new things, and obviously behind social media people can create all these personas and all this fakery, or just dig themselves deeper into denial and deeper into like dishonesty to like basically just maintain the identity, which is going to be the expense of their physical health, and usually even their psychological health will degrade over time too, which just do your own research on that and see. But again, it's just my opinion, we're getting off subject. So anyways, hopefully some of this stuff has been useful, and again, I just wanted to share something a little more slightly personal and not quite as critical, not quite as, or maybe it is, I don't know, but to me it seems a little more useful, and hopefully it's helpful. But anyways, thanks for watching this video, and I'll talk to you soon.